Hello and welcome to another edition of Another Book Review. This week I'm going to be reviewing Ted Chiang's short story collection, Exhalation. I'll go ahead and cover the author's background before going into some of the short stories that I like the most of this collection. I'll finish off with recommendations and what I will be reading for next time. Ted Chiang is a fairly well-known science fiction author. He has written a couple of collections. This one and Stories of Your Life and Others, which is the collection that contains the short story of Your Life, which was the basis for the movie Arrival. I don't believe he's ever written a full-length novel. He's kind of known for being a master of the short story form, and there's about 7 or 8 of his stories in this collection. And the stories that kind of stood out to me the most, I did read his previous collection. For this one, Exhalation, the stories that stood out to me the most, there's one that's almost like a almost like a Arabian Nights style fairy tale that involves time travel in a really unique and cool way. The longest piece in the book is a short story called The Life Cycle of Software Objects, I believe is the title. And that's about 100 pages. That's almost novella length. And I had read that earlier as a standalone story. And that story by itself could probably teach a full course because there's so many weighty philosophical issues in that story alone. And I think that story is going to be the standout for this collection. And it didn't have quite the same gut punch as The Story of Your Life, which I felt was the best story in his previous collection. But there's so much going on there, and there's so much really dense philosophical issues that kind of get raised that story by itself I would definitely recommend checking out. It was at one point free online. I don't know if it still is, but if you're someone who's never read any Ted Chiang, that maybe not be a bad place to start. And then finally, the last story that I want to kind of highlight here was a story about this idea of what are called prisms, which essentially, not to overcomplicate it, they essentially make a forking path. So it's a kind of consumer good that you can buy. You can activate the prism when you have to make a decision, and then that path forks. And then you're able to, after whatever period of time you choose to, you can go back and speak to yourself, whoever made another decision. So for instance, if you decided to marry someone, you could find, if you did decide to marry someone in your timeline, they have what are called Paracels, which is the person who didn't make that decision or made the opposite decision. It's actually a pretty interesting concept. That story, in my opinion, goes on maybe a little bit too much, a little bit too long, but I think the ending of it is pretty strong. And those are probably the 3 strongest stories. There's a lot of stories in here that deal with the difference between free will and fate or determinism, however you want to phrase that concept. There's a few stories in here that deal with that in interesting ways. So he's kind of known for writing what I would call kind of philosophical science fiction. Most of what he writes, there is a deeper point to his writing. It's not really so much writing for fun as much as he has kind of an idea of why things are the way they are. And I think his strength as a writer is kind of understanding the interaction between science and technology at the human level of how it impacts people's day-to-day lives in a really profound way. I think he can be accused of being maybe a little bit, because he's dealing in the short story form, he's not really known to be very flowery or very, how do I say this? His prose is not necessarily overly flowery or overly beautiful. It's very workmanlike, in my opinion. But because he's writing in the short story form, I think it really works. Clearly, when you're reading him, it feels like someone who's thought about every single sentence that he's laid down. And I think he tries to be economical in a way that I appreciate. Some of the stories obviously are better than others, and some of them kind of impacted me more than others. But that's, for the most part, my feelings on Ted Chiang, who I would recommend this book to. If you read his first collection, the Stories of Your Life and Others, I would definitely check this out because I think as a collection, it is better. It's a stronger overall collection. I will say the The Story of Your Life, the short story that is the basis for Arrival, I think is still his best short story that I've read of his. But there's stuff in here that equals that or comes close to it. So if you haven't read that, I would go read that. If you have read that, I would go pick this up. If you have not read any Ted Chiang and don't know where to start, this is not a bad collection to start with. I would still probably start you on Stories of Your Life. Obviously there's no continuity issues or anything, but I think that is maybe a good primer for this, because I think that you'll get his best short story in my opinion. So that's Ted Chiang, Exhalation. Next time I'm going to be reading and reviewing Ann Patchett, The Dutch House, on audiobook. So I hope to have that out in the next week or so. Until next time, if you have read Ted Chiang and would like to comment on him to get that conversation started, please leave it in the comment section below. Until next time, please follow me on Twitter. I'll have my Twitter link in the description. And like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Until next time, bye.